John Joseph Matthews was an author, a historian. He was a tribal councilman for the Osages, and he was what they called a mixed blood, which you don't really hear that term as much, but there were full bloods and mixed bloods. And so he was Osage on his father's side. He grew up in, it was Indian territory. There was no such thing as Oklahoma yet. So of course the Osages were settled in Indian territory after they left their diminished reservation in Kansas. So he grew up in Pawhuska, the capital of the Osage Nation. Really exciting place for him to be a boy. And as he grew up there, oil was found in the Osage land, and he and his family benefited from the head rights that they received. So they would get a quarterly payment for the oil royalties that was due to them. So every Osage that was on the Dawes roll, they were entitled to that percentage of the overall royalties. So the Osages were actually pretty wealthy before that because they were receiving a good payment for their land that they sold in Kansas, which is usually you hear about Native Americans being ripped off and not being really paid anything for their land. And of course they were pressured to sign the treaty, and they kept losing more and more of their land. But they had a good lawyer who got them a good deal, and so they were receiving generous payments for their land in Kansas, which was kind of unusual. And in the early 20th century, a newspaper called them the richest people on earth, per capita. And I believe the first time that was mentioned, it was even before oil was found. So then, oil was found. It really didn't get cooking until early in the 20th century. It was found, I think, in the 1890s. But with the rise of the automobile and car culture taking over, then there was this huge demand for oil, and the tribe became pretty wealthy. John Joseph Matthews' story is very interesting because he defies, I think, a lot of stereotypes that some people might have about natives, and that he grew up in a home that was fairly well-to-do, and I think even at one point his family had a driver and had servants. So kind of my first chapter I called Silver Spur instead of Silver Spoon, because he loved to ride horses, and he was always having adventures as a boy, riding all around Osage County on his horse with his hunting dog. So relatively privileged upbringing, prominent father in the community, and he spent a lot of time with traditional Osages. So, I mean, he, as a mixed blood and as sort of a town person living in town, he had a different upbringing than the traditional Osages. But he would ride over to their communities and play with Osage boys and listen to the elders and hear their stories. A lot of other young men at the time, there's kind of war fever was in the air. They wanted to get involved and enlist. Him being a Native American was interesting because, Native Americans weren't even really citizens at that time, not even to the Snyder Act, which I think was 1920 or so. So Native Americans were enlisting in World War I in, disproportionate numbers. Some of that had to do with the warrior culture and kind of initiation and proving yourself as a man. But so Matthews enlisted. He taught aviation, so he taught night flying. So he was teaching the guys that they sent over to France to fight the Red Baron and so forth. So after his work with the military and the government, Matthews went back to school at the University of Oklahoma and resumed his studies. So, and he felt like they wanted to rush him through school, and that he had gathered some credits through flight school and different things, but he wanted to get a full education, so he did a year and a half after returning. And so he was dating a lot of women and a very popular guy, and so he kind of enjoyed that sort of popularity of being a returned veteran. And then he went on to Oxford, and he was studying science there and literature. He wanted to do what he called cultural preservation. He saw that his tribe's people's culture was changing rapidly. You had this influx of money, and so therefore you had an influx of people trying to get that money, and the money would kind of change their way of life and how, their outlook on things. So he wanted to try to preserve things because he saw the cultural loss, and he was worried that that would go away entirely. So Kind of a famous story about Matthews is when he was traveling in North Africa. He went on a hunting trip, and this group of Berber tribesmen rode up on their horses, and they start to circle their camp. I think they had built a little camp, and they were going to have dinner. And so it's just Matthews and his guide and the cook. And these Berber tribesmen who are not Muslim, but sort of what he called kind of a wild, tribe of indigenous people out there. And they circle their camp, and they have these old Winchester rifles, and they're shooting them in the air and just, creating this real scene. And Matthews thought at first, this was threatening him. It was really alarming at first, but then he realized this is just like the sort of thing that I saw as a kid in Osage Nation. And he remembered being out on the prairie, and something similar happened where these Osage warriors rode up and they're shooting their guns, and he called it, it was really just joy shooting. They weren't trying to scare him or kill anybody, but it was just joy of life, just joy of living. And so he had this feeling like, well, what am I doing out here? I'm traveling around to all these other cultures, but I have my own culture. I have my own tribes people. And so he said, I should go back and study them and write about them. So it's kind of an epiphany he had way out in Algeria. And the myth goes that then he went straight back to Pahaska, but there was a number of years that passed between his homecoming. But I think that gave him an impetus to return and write about his people. The state of Native Americans in the United States was not great at that time. The early 20th century was kind of a low point in some ways, in that there had been so much forced assimilation and acculturation. The Dawes Act had been passed in the early 20th century. Osage allotment occurred by 1906. They held out a little bit longer, and they were smart because they were able to hold on to their land base. And even after the land was allotted and kind of distributed to individual Osages, they kept there wasn't any excess land that could then be opened up for white settlement. So all around Oklahoma there were these land runs, and there was a big land run and then a bunch of other smaller land runs. But the Osages were able to keep their land base, which was really good. But the situation was bad, I think, for American Indians in general in the 10s and the 1920s. The Osages were kind of an exception because of the oil that was found on their land, and it gave them great wealth. But then on the other hand, it led to widespread exploitation. Guardians would take advantage of natives that were ruled incompetent if they were considered to be illiterate or not educated. And in some cases, there were natives who were educated and very intelligent, but they were still called incompetent. And these guardians could, take advantage of them financially, and this led to even, conspiracies of murder that, like David Cran writes about that in Killers of the Flower Moon. But so that was very harmful for the Osages. So even with all the benefits they received financially, they were victimized and murdered, exploited in different ways. Other tribes without the benefit of wealth, they were rapidly losing their culture. They were losing speakers of their language, because of that whole process of Indian education and the boarding school system, where the forced assimilation that produced, they were trying to produce basically imitation white men, out of the Indians. So you think of back to Carlisle Industrial Indian School and Colonel Pratt, Captain Pratt as well, who famously said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So that's a paraphrase of what he said, to try to just get rid of all the tradition and all the the wildness, and just turn them into good American citizens who can be injected into the economy, and just kind of, they might look Indian, but they're white on the inside was the goal. So things were really bad for Native Americans at this point, and John Joseph Matthews, just by virtue of being a Native American writer, he was this was a new idea for a lot of people, this new paradigm of an Indian intellectual or an Indian author. Wakanta, The Osage and the White Man's Road, and it came out in 1932. It was a Book of the Month alternate selection, so that was kind of a big deal. Like, a lot of people read it at the time. And so it was this breakthrough book, one of the first books by a Native American writer that sold that many copies. I mean, there really wasn't a concept of an American Indian author at that time in 1932. People just weren't thinking of like Native intellectuals or Native writers. So he really helped to change the mainstream perception, I think, of Native Americans to some degree. And this book, in telling of Osages, I think by extension, it teaches of Lower Plains Indians tribes, like the Omahas and the Otos. So he was kind of an intermediary, I think, between this middle-class reading culture and Native American culture. So he was, being of both European and Osage ancestry, he kind of played that role as a public intellectual and an intermediary between the cultures. His work was so influential to Osage peoples, especially his book called The Osages, which was a tribal history. And it's 600 plus pages. They called it the Big Green Book. So young Osages, they would read it and they just called it the Big Green Book. And there was a story that was told by Garrick Bailey, who's a University of Tulsa anthropologist. And he went to University of Oklahoma, and he said he was out walking to class and he ran into a friend of his, a fellow student who was Osage. And the Osage guy's hair was all mussed and his clothes were all wrinkled. And Garrick Bailey thought, oh, he's been up all night, partying or something. And he asked his friend what was going on. And his Osage friend said, I've been up all night reading The Osages, by John Joseph Matthews. And he skipped classes to read it. He just almost read it straight through, which is hard to believe because it's a tome, real doorstopper. But he told Garrick Bailey, now I know who I am, after reading this book. So I think, especially, in the 60s, 70s, and on, there were many Osages who they were trying to reconnect to their culture and learn about their traditions because they had been, in some ways, very assimilated. And so, but yeah, it was hugely influential to young Osages. John Joseph Matthews' life is so inspiring, in part because he broke the mold of how people thought about Native Americans. To me, he's a beautiful writer. His prose style is so lucid. He's been called a prose poet, which I agree with. And if you read his novel Sundown, when he writes about being a student at the University of Oklahoma, and he writes about these dances and balls, it's like you feel like you're in the room and you can smell the perfume and you can hear the jazz music and you can feel his anxiety. And so he's just an incredibly evocative writer. And I thought, here is a contemporary of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, but people don't know about him. And he's really a lost generation writer like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and others, and that he was in the World War I period and traveled all around Europe afterward and Northern Africa. So he kind of wandered around like these expatriates that are famous and written about. I thought, here's an amazing writer, a prose poet, and with just such a fascinating life history of being someone that was kind of drawing from both the Euro-American world and the Native American world.